The iron rod crashed down with devastating force. Robert Walkie never had a chance to react. It was June 20th, 1929, inside the laundry room of Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary, when a man who described himself as the embodiment of cruelty finally fulfilled his threat. Carl Panzram had warned the prison warden as soon as he arrived, "I'll kill the first person who bothers me." Walkie, the laundry supervisor notorious for tormenting inmates, ignored all the warnings. He pushed the wrong man one time too many. When the guards discovered Walkie's body, his skull was completely destroyed. Standing over him was inmate number 31614, Carl Panzram, waiting quietly for whatever would happen next. This wasn't the first time Panzram had killed. By his own admission, this was his 21st murder. What set this killing apart wasn't the savagery. Panzram had mastered brutality over many years. What made it different was that this time, Carl Panzram wanted to die for his crime. When officials offered him legal appeals and activists tried to intervene to save his life, Panzram's response was chilling. "The only thanks you and your kind will ever get from me for your efforts on my behalf is that I wish you all had one neck and that I had my hands on it." Before we delve into the mind of one of America's most unsettling criminals, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Carl Panzram's story doesn't begin with violence, but with the birth of a child on a Minnesota farm. On June 28, 1891, Johann and Matilda Panzram, immigrants from East Prussia, welcomed their sixth child. They named him Charles, though he would later go by Carl. Looking at that baby, no one could have guessed they were witnessing the arrival of someone who would become one of the country's most vicious serial killers. The Panzram farm near East Grand Forks was not a place for a happy childhood. Johann and Matilda ran their home with the strictness of a prison. Their 7 children worked the fields from sunrise to sunset, and when school laws forced them to attend classes during the day, their parents made them work all night instead. Carl later recalled getting only 2 hours of sleep before heading to school. Punishments for any mistake included being chained up or left without food for days. By the age of 5, Carl already felt different from other kids. He would later write that he didn't like other children, and they didn't like him. He became a liar and a thief before he even learned to tie his shoes. But the real turning point came when Carl was 7. His father left the family without warning, abandoning Matilda to raise 7 children alone on a struggling farm. Around this time, Carl developed a severe infection in his skull that required surgery. The operation was done at home, which only made things worse. By the time he was finally taken to a hospital, the damage may have already been done. Doctors could never say for sure if the infection and the botched surgery caused brain damage, but the timing was suspicious. After the surgery, Carl's behavior grew more violent and uncontrollable. One by one, his older brothers left home. The family was falling apart. In 1905, his stepbrother Louis drowned while working as a lumberjack. Carl was now left with a mother who saw him only as a burden and a source of free labor. The first signs of Carl's future emerged when he was just 8. In 1899, he was arrested for being drunk and disorderly, only 8 years old. 4 years later, at 12, he was arrested again for drunkenness and being incorrigible. That same year, he committed his first major theft, stealing cake, apples, and a revolver from a neighbor's house. In October 1903, Matilda Panzram made a decision that would change her son's life forever. She sent 12-year-old Carl to the Minnesota State Training School, a reform school for troubled boys. What happened to Carl in that institution would destroy whatever humanity he had left. The Minnesota State Training School was a nightmare disguised as rehabilitation. Carl later wrote that staff members regularly beat, tortured, and raped the children in a room they called the paint shop, because boys left that room covered in their own blood and bruises. The abuse was systematic, relentless, and cruel. Carl's formal education in crime began in earnest in 1906, when he was arrested for burglary in Montana. He was sentenced to a year at the Montana State Reform School in Miles City. If the Minnesota school had been bad, Montana was even worse. The guards were more violent, the conditions even harsher, and Carl learned a simple lesson. The strong prey on the weak, and he was determined to be strong. When a guard named Buschert punished Carl for a minor offense, Carl retaliated by grabbing a wooden board and beating the guard so badly that he was left critically injured. For this, Carl was thrown into solitary confinement. But he didn't care. He had proven to himself that he could hurt others worse than they could hurt him. In 1907, Carl and another inmate named James Benson escaped from the Montana State Reform School. What followed was a weeks-long crime spree across Montana that included robbery, burglary, and arson. Carl had a particular hatred for churches. burning several during the spree. When asked later why he targeted churches, Carl said he despised anything that claimed to represent goodness or hope. After parting ways with Benson, Carl made a decision that would give him access to weapons and training that would make him even more dangerous. While drunk in a Helena saloon, he enlisted in the United States Army. The military assigned him to the 6th Infantry at Fort William Henry Harrison. But Carl was a terrible soldier. He refused to follow orders, stole supplies, and made life miserable for everyone around him. The Army court-martialed him for stealing $88.24 worth of supplies, a significant sum in 1907. He served his sentence at the United States Disciplinary Barracks at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, from April 1908 to August 1910. Carl would later write that if he had been a bad person before Leavenworth, the military prison erased any last bit of goodness left in him. The guards at Leavenworth were cruel, even by the harsh standards of early 20th century military justice. Carl was beaten, starved, and subjected to punishments that would be considered torture today. But instead of breaking him, these experiences taught Carl new depths of cruelty. He watched the guards closely, learned their methods, and promised himself that one day he would use those same techniques against innocent people. When Carl was finally released and dishonorably discharged in August 1910, he was no longer just a violent young man, he was something closer to a human weapon. At just 20 years old, he had spent most of his life in institutions and had learned that violence wasn't just acceptable, it was the best way to get what he wanted. After leaving Carl began a criminal career that would last for the next 18 years. His approach was always the same: steal whatever he could, hurt anyone who got in his way, and vanish before the authorities could catch him. But simple theft wasn't enough for Carl. He had developed darker desires that ordinary crime couldn't satisfy. He discovered that he enjoyed rape almost as much as robbery. He began to systematically target men he had robbed, forcing them to submit to sexual assault before leaving them beaten and humiliated. Years of hard labor in prisons had made Carl physically powerful, and most men simply couldn't fight him off. Between 1910 and 1920, Carl was arrested and imprisoned over and over again across the American West and Southwest. He served time in California, Texas, Oregon, Idaho, Montana, Connecticut, and New York. Every time he was locked up, there was violence against guards, escape attempts, and brutal retaliation from prison staff. But prison also gave Carl time to think, and what he thought about was murder. He later wrote that during his many stints behind bars, he spent countless hours planning not just individual killings, but mass murder. He fantasized about poisoning city water supplies, sinking ships, and even starting wars between nations. These weren't just idle thoughts. Carl was making detailed plans for maximum destruction. In 1915, while serving time at Oregon State Penitentiary under the name Jeff Baldwin, Carl got his first real taste of murder. He helped another inmate, Otto Hooker, escape from prison. During Hooker's escape, the prison superintendent, Harry Minto, was killed. Although Carl didn't pull the trigger, he had made the murder possible. The feeling of being involved in a killing thrilled him in a way that robbery never had. Carl managed to escape from Oregon State Penitentiary twice, the second time by squeezing through the bars of his cell. Each escape taught him new tricks and gave him more confidence. By 1918, after his second successful escape from Oregon, Carl had become one of America's most wanted fugitives. Using the alias John O'Leary, Carl traveled all over the country and even overseas. He worked on ships, sailed to Panama and Europe, and spent time in Peru working in copper mines. But no matter where he went, Carl left behind a trail of theft, assault, and increasingly, murder. The year 1920 marked a turning point for Carl Panzram. After robbing a jewelry store in Bridgeport, Connecticut, he found himself with $1,500 in cash, a fortune at the time, and enough to fund the violent fantasies he'd been planning for years. But before he could begin his true killing spree, Carl wanted to settle an old score. He had never forgotten the way he was treated at Fort Leavenworth, especially by the man who had signed off on his sentence, William Howard Taft, who had been Secretary of War at the time and was now a former U.S. president. On September 16, 1920, Carl broke into Taft's mansion in New Haven, Connecticut. He stole a large amount of jewelry and bonds, but what he really wanted was Taft's personal Colt M1911.45 caliber pistol. Carl later wrote that stealing from Taft gave him more satisfaction than any of his previous crimes. It wasn't just about the money, it was personal revenge against the man who represented everything Carl hated about authority and society. With Taft's stolen money, Carl bought a small sailing yacht called the Akita. This boat would become his floating base for murder over the next few years. Carl sailed the Akita to City Island in the Bronx, where he began searching for victims among the sailors who hung out in the waterfront bars. Carl's method was both calculated and ruthless. He would approach sailors who were alone in bars, offer them work on his yacht, or simply invite them aboard for drinks. Once his victims were on the boat, Carl would get them drunk, sexually assault them, shoot them with Taft's stolen pistol, and dump their bodies in Long Island Sound near Execution Rocks Light. The location was no accident. Execution Rocks Light was infamous for its dangerous rocks that had destroyed many ships over the years. Carl knew that bodies dumped there would either be swept out to sea or smashed against the rocks, making identification impossible. It was the perfect place to get rid of evidence. For 3 months, Carl used City Island as his base, systematically murdering sailors. He later claimed to have killed 10 men during this period, though only some of these murders could be confirmed. What is certain is that several sailors vanished after being seen with a man matching Carl's description, and their bodies were never found. Carl's killing spree on the yacht ended by chance. During a storm, the Akita ran aground and sank near Atlantic City, New Jersey. His last 2 intended victims managed to escape in the chaos. If the boat hadn't sunk, Carl might have continued killing sailors for much longer. After losing his floating headquarters, Carl was arrested in Stamford, Connecticut, for burglary and carrying a loaded handgun. He spent 6 months in jail in Bridgeport, but prison only made him more determined to escalate his violence. When he was released in 1921, Carl went to Philadelphia, where he got into a shootout with police. Facing a long prison sentence, he managed to make bail and immediately fled to Norfolk, Virginia, where he boarded a ship to Portuguese Angola in southern Africa. What Carl did in Angola stands among the most horrifying crimes in the history of serial murder. Working as a foreman on an oil rig, he had access to remote areas and vulnerable local people. When he grew bored with the job, he set the oil rig on fire out of spite. Then, Carl began a campaign of sexual violence and murder against the local population. He paid families to bring him young girls, whom he assaulted before sending them back and demanding his money be returned. When the families tried to appease him by offering even younger children, Carl's violence escalated to murder. According to his own confession, he raped and killed an Angolan boy who was likely around 11 or 12 years old, but that wasn't enough for him. Carl wrote that he hired 6 local men to take him crocodile hunting in a canoe. Once they were deep in the backwaters, he shot all 6 men with a Luger pistol and fed their bodies to the crocodiles. The way Carl described these murders was almost as chilling as the acts themselves. He wrote about killing 6 innocent men as if it were just another business deal. He even noted with satisfaction that the crocodiles took care of the evidence. When local authorities began investigating the disappearances, Carl was forced to flee through the rainforest to the Belgian Congo. Even there, he continued to commit crimes and assaults until he was finally forced to leave Africa altogether. Returning to the United States in 1922, Carl entered the most closely documented period of his criminal life. He had learned from his time abroad that he preferred killing to simple theft, but he also realized he needed to be more careful to avoid getting caught. Back in New York, Carl had a silencer fitted to a pistol he'd brought from Africa. His plan was to become a professional killer, but when he tested the silencer, he found it was still too loud. If that heavy caliber pistol and the silencer had only worked as I thought it would, he later wrote, I would have gone into the murder business on a wholesale scale. Disappointed that his assassination plans had failed, Carl returned to what he knew best, targeting those who couldn't fight back. In July 1922, in Salem, Massachusetts, he abducted a young boy and killed him by beating him with a rock. Later that year, near New Haven, Connecticut, he strangled another child. Carl briefly worked as a night watchman in Yonkers, New York, but honest work bored him. In 1923, he went back to his yacht-based hunting, stealing boats and using them to find new victims. On June 1923, Carl stole 2 yachts in quick succession. The first belonged to Dr. Charles Payne of Larchmont, New York, but Carl lost control of the boat and crashed it onto rocks near New Rochelle. The second yacht belonged to the local police chief of New Rochelle, a bold move that showed Carl's growing contempt for law enforcement. Using the police chief's stolen yacht, Carl lured a 15-year-old boy named George Wallace aboard, promising him a job. Instead, Carl sexually assaulted the boy repeatedly over several days, but George Wallace became an unwilling witness to something even worse. On June 27, 1923, while sailing near Kingston, New York, Carl encountered a man he believed was planning to rob him. Carl's response was immediate and deadly. He shot the man with a .38 caliber pistol and threw the body into the river. George Wallace saw the murder happen. The next day, when they docked at Poughkeepsie, Wallace finally saw his chance. While Carl was distracted by stealing fishing nets, Wallace jumped overboard and swam to shore. He immediately reported both his assault and the murder he had witnessed to police in Yonkers. The police issued an alert for Captain John O'Leary, one of Carl's many aliases, which led to his arrest in Nyack on June 29, 1923, for the first time in his criminal career. Carl faced charges not just for robbery and assault, but for murder. A witness had survived, and the authorities finally had testimony that could put Carl away for life. Carl's reaction to his arrest showed the cunning that had kept him free for so long. He convinced his lawyer to accept ownership of a stolen boat in exchange for bail money, then skipped bail as soon as he was released. By the time government agents seized the boat, Carl was already gone. His freedom didn't last long. On August 26, 1923, John O'Leary was arrested in Larchmont, New York, after breaking into a train depot. This time, there would be no escape and no bail. Carl was sentenced to 5 years in prison, to be served first at Sing Sing prison and then at Clinton prison, and even in maximum security, Carl couldn't stop himself from trying to escape. He made an attempt at Clinton prison and ended up with serious injuries, including a damaged spine and broken ankles. He also assaulted a guard, adding more charges to his already long record. But prison also gave Carl something he'd never had before: time to reflect on his crimes without the constant pressure of running from the law. When he was released in July 1928, after nearly 5 years, Carl had come to a chilling realization about himself. He wasn't going to stop killing. In fact, he was determined to get even better at it. Carl's last month of freedom, August 1928, was a concentrated burst of the violence that had defined his life. On August 20th, he broke into a dentist's home in Washington, D.C., stealing a radio and jewelry, but theft no longer satisfied him. That same month, Carl murdered at least 3 more people. In Salem, he killed a young boy. In Connecticut, he murdered another child. And in Philadelphia, he killed 14-year-old Alexander Yus, a newsboy who happened to cross Carl's path near the Delaware River. Carl's method with Alexander was especially cruel. He forced the boy to help him steal from a yacht, then killed him and wrapped his body in a blanket, along with pieces of a broken radio. The way he mixed murder with the casual disposal of evidence showed just how completely Carl had lost any sense of humanity. When Carl was arrested on August 30, 1928, he was no longer the elusive criminal who had spent years outsmarting the authorities. He was exhausted from running, weary of hiding, and ready to face whatever punishment awaited him. For the first time in his long criminal history, Carl gave the police his real name. During questioning, he confessed to multiple murders, providing details so graphic and precise that even seasoned detectives were stunned. When asked why he targeted children, Carl's answer was brutally honest. He said he hated humanity and found pleasure in killing. Given his extensive criminal record and his confessions to 21 murders, Carl Panzram was sentenced to 25 years to life at Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary. He was assigned inmate number 31,614, returning almost full circle to the institution where, nearly 2 decades earlier, his transformation into a killer had begun. Upon arrival, Carl issued a direct warning to the warden: "I'll kill the first man that bothers me." Recognizing the danger he posed, prison officials assigned Carl to work alone in the laundry room, supervised only by civilian foreman Robert Walkie. Walkie was notorious for bullying and harassing prisoners. Despite repeated warnings from Carl, Walkie continued his aggressive behavior. On June 20, 1929, Carl finally acted on his threat. Using an iron bar, he struck Walkie with such force that the man's skull was completely crushed. The murder was swift and brutal, and when the guards arrived, Carl was standing calmly over the body, waiting for the consequences. Carl's trial for Walkie's murder was quick. He was found guilty and sentenced to death by hanging. When offered the chance to appeal, Carl refused all legal help and told anyone who tried to intervene that he wished they all had one neck so he could strangle them at once. He had no interest in mercy or redemption. While on death row, Carl encountered the only person who ever showed him genuine kindness: prison guard Henry Lesser. Lesser began giving Carl small amounts of money so he could buy cigarettes. This simple act of humanity surprised Carl so much that, when Lesser provided him with writing materials, Carl began to document his entire criminal life. The result was a detailed autobiography that remains one of the most disturbing confessions in the history of crime. Carl started his written confession with a statement that revealed his utter lack of remorse. In my lifetime, I have murdered 21 human beings. I have committed thousands of burglaries, robberies, larcenies, arson, and last but not least, I have committed sodomy on more than 1,000 male human beings. For all these things, I am not in the least bit sorry. His words were chilling, but nearly everything he wrote could be verified or corroborated by official records, making his manuscript one of the most reliable first-person accounts of serial murder ever recorded. On September 5, 1930, Carl Panzram walked to the gallows at Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary. Even in his final moments, he remained defiant. When the guards tried to place the traditional black hood over his head, Carl spat in the executioner's face. Asked if he had any last words, he replied, "Yes, hurry it up, you Hoosier bastard. I could kill a dozen men while you're messing around." At 6:02 a.m., Carl Panzram was pronounced dead. He was 39 years old and had spent more than half his life in reform schools and prisons. His death ended a criminal career that had spanned 3 decades and crossed continents. But Carl's story didn't end with his execution. The autobiography he wrote in his final months, preserved by Henry Lesser, would eventually be published and studied by criminologists, psychologists, and true crime researchers. His confessions provided a rare and unfiltered look into the mind of a serial killer, and his life became a case study in how childhood abuse, institutional cruelty, and systematic dehumanization can create monsters. Carl's early experiences in reform schools and military prisons didn't excuse his later crimes, but they help explain how a troubled child could become one of America's most prolific killers. The victims. Carl left behind the sailors murdered on his yacht, the children killed in multiple states, the men he shot and fed to crocodiles in Africa represent dozens of lives cut short by one man's inability to feel empathy or remorse. Their deaths are a grim reminder of the importance of recognizing and treating violent behavior before it escalates to murder. Carl Panzram died as he had lived, angry, violent, and completely unrepentant. His final words to the world were a demand that his execution be sped up, so he wouldn't have to waste any more time with people he despised. It was a fitting end to a life that brought only pain and death to everyone it touched. What do you think about Carl Panzram's story? Do you believe his childhood experiences explain his later crimes, or do you think some people are simply born evil? Was there ever a moment when Carl could have been saved, or was he beyond redemption from the start? Share your thoughts in the comments below that if you found this case as disturbing and fascinating as we did. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into America's most notorious criminals. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode. If this video kept you engaged, please like it and share it with anyone who appreciates well-researched true crime stories. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next episode.